Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with the Indians continent, talking about a lot of the stuff with the Native Americans and some of their history and things like that. But we're now on to the Europe they came from. The great explorations were made in the 16th and 17th centuries, starting from a Europe which had experienced two great changes, called the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Renaissance was in part the culmination of a trend already observable in the Middle Ages. Latin had long been the language of scholarship, and Italian art showed no sharp break, but rather a smooth transition from Cimabue to Giotto, and on the greater achievements of Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo. But this was stimulated by the rediscovery of ancient statues and of old Greek manuscripts. Greek took its place because Latin is the main part of the gentleman's education. Scholarly research dissipated many legends in which people had long believed. The Reformation was centered in Germany, and as the Renaissance had been in Italy, it too looked back at the past of. Wait, I just lost my place because I was looking at something. Oh boy. It too looked back to the past in the very act of creating the future. But it was not the pagan past of Greece. It was an attempt to re-establish the early Christian church, freed from the accretions of tradition and the imagination of men. It divided Western Europe into two parts, a southern section, though extending as far north as Ireland and Poland, which remained faithful to Roman Catholicism, and oh boy, remained faithful in a northern part including Great Britain, Holland, some of Germany and Switzerland, and all of Scandinavia, which became Protestant. The Reformation did not establish one church, but rather a series of national churches: Anglican, Esblasian in England, Lutheran in Germany and Scandinavia, Calvinists in Holland and Scotland, Presbyterian, and Protestant minority in France called Huguenots. These differed from each other chiefly in ritual and forms of church government. All, however, rejected the Pope as the head of the church and looked to the Bible instead of church tradition as the final authority. Of course, religion and politics were frequently intermixed. The 30 Years' War in Germany, 1618 to 1648, began as a quarrel between the Catholics and the Calvinists in Bohemia, but ended as an attempt to extend frontiers of France, a Catholic country, but allied to Protestant Sweden because of a common fear of Catholic Austria and Spain. Politically, Europe was entering the period of national monarchy authority. Not national monarchy. Most states in the Middle Ages had been monarchies in form, but royal clergy and the autonomy of certain city-states, which, especially in Germany, the Netherlands and Italy, were almost independent. The so-called Holy Roman Empire, mainly but not exclusively German, had failed to achieve European unity. Real power settled more and more in the rulers of countries which, in the main, had a common speech and a common national tradition. England, Scotland, France, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Sweden, Russia, and Turkey, the only non-Christian power in Europe, tended to conform to this pattern. The invention of the cannon weakened the power of the armored cavalry and the stone castles of the nobility. The controversies of the Reformation weakened the political influence of the clergy. As for the commercial middle classes in the towns, they often preferred the single law of a monarch to the confusion of feudal nobles, and sided with the king. There were some exceptions to the general rule. The Swiss repelled the Austrians and Burgundians from their Alpine strongholds and emerged as an independent republic. With greater difficulty, the Netherlands shook off the combined religious and political tyranny of Spain. Poland remained in its feudal conditions as an aristocracy of nobles with an elective kingship. England, though strongly centralized under the Tudor dynasty from Henry VII to Elizabeth I, preserved its elected parliament, and in the 17th century briefly established a republic, the Commonwealth, under the dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. Later, with the return of the Stuart dynasty, there was a compromise in the tactic condition that, while the king might reign, it was the landed aristocracy, represented by Parliament, which really ruled. One more fact remains to be mentioned which had a greater bearing on the settlement of America. This was the coming of capitalism and commercialism. In the Middle Ages, tenants paid their master chiefly in labor or a share of the crops, like the modern sharecropper in the South, and very little in actual cash. But as money became more abundant and circulated more rapidly, it was more convenient for both landlord and tenant to substitute simple rent for feudal services. Yeah, it's good that they get into this stuff because a lot of this really does build up the United States. Um, you can't look at the United States in its colonization, in its governance, and all that without looking at the greater context of Europe at this time. And it really bleeds into what is America. For instance, if there was no Reformation, America is more Catholic, but America today is more Protestant. Protestantism is very common in the United States. Um, there also is less, without the Renaissance, you don't have a lot of the free thinking that a lot of the founding fathers of the United States would have. So it's just very common. But now we'll look at some pictures here. In so the left, just right here. In the left picture here, King Philip II of Spain sent his armada against the navy of Queen Elizabeth I of England. The armada was soundly defeated. Above, Queen Elizabeth I, the English monarch. At the top is the royal procession through London on the occasion of the coronation of Edward VI. The opposite center here is Philip II of Spain, who built the armada. And then here is Martin Luther, the priest who started the Reformation. Obviously, there's a church named after him, Lutheranism, the Lutheran Church. And at the opposite right, so right here, is an example of Roman Catholic propaganda, a drawing of horrible cruelties perpetrated by Protestants, burning churches and desecrating tombs. Yeah, we don't think about it today because it just doesn't happen, but there was a lot of animosity between Protestants and Catholics, and it led to a lot of warfare and death and things like that. And we don't have that nowadays, and it's a very odd concept because a lot of this stuff had been sorted out, obviously, at this time and a little bit later. Oh boy. Now on to the greater explorations. Oh boy. Almost certainly, the first Europeans to visit America were Norwegian and Icelandic Vikings, who sailed westward about 1000 AD. They reported a markland or land of woods, and of Vinland or land of grapes. How far south they ventured, we do not know, but vestiges of their temporary settlements have been recently found in Newfoundland. They were among the most venturous of men, sailing in open boats with but a single sail to lands completely unknown. In Europe, they were showed In Europe they showed the same boldness, raiding Scotland, Ireland, and England, settling in northern France, Normandy, and Sicily, and enlisting in the Varangian bodyguard of the Greek emperors of Constantinople. They also gave a name to Russia. But their western discoveries were not followed up by settlement except in coastal Greenland, which eventually passed to the hands of Denmark. They seem to have been unknown in most of Europe at that time, and scholars doubt that Columbus was aware of them. American history really begins with the voyage of the Genoese explorer Christopher Columbus in the service of Spain. Geographers had long known that the earth was spherical, and thus one could reach the Far East by sailing west. Already under the command of the Portuguese Henry the Navigator, ships had cautiously sailed down the African west coast seeking an all-water route around southern Africa. They had resources which the Vikings lacked: the compass, maps of eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean shores, and covered decks. But most men were not scholars. Sailors for such a voyage were hard to recruit. How to return to Europe if one sailed downhill to the other side of the world? Suppose one were to drop off into space. What if one encountered impossible dangers? One medieval writer had declared the sun was red in the evening because she looketh down into hell. Better play it safe and hug familiar shores. Queen Isabel of Castile, whose marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon had united Spain, secured loans which financed the expedition. Almost at the same time, the Spaniards conquered Granada, the last Moorish stronghold. The great day of Spanish power had arrived. Columbus first reached some of the West Indies in 1492. In subsequent voyages he extended the knowledge of the Caribbean area, but he never reached any part of the present United States. An Englishman of Venetian descent, John Cabot, discovered Newfoundland, the Newfound Land, and thus laid this cornerstone for the British Overseas Empire. But the early discoveries were largely Spanish and Portuguese. Ferdinand Magellan was the first to attempt a voyage around the world. He died in passage, but one of his ships completed the circuit. Pope Alexander VI divided the colonial world between Spain and Portugal, giving America to Spain and Africa, India, and eastern Brazil to Portugal. Naturally, the Protestant nations such as England and Holland paid him no attention. And even Catholic France colonized colonized within American territory. England undertook no settlement until James I, but the Elizabethan period may be said to have cleared the way for an empire by winning. Oh boy, there's a lot more than I thought here. By winning the mastery of the sea and defeating the Spanish Armada in 1588. It is a curious thing to note that for many national claims were based upon explorations made by foreigners, Columbus and Cabot were of Italian origin. Magellan, Portuguese by birth, enabled Spain to gain the Philippines. The island of King Philip. Henry Hudson, an Englishman, by his discoveries in the river valley which bears his name, made possible the Dutch colony of New Netherland, now New York. In their thirst for gold, the Spaniards built a great American empire. Hernando Cortez in Mexico and Francisco Pizarro in Peru were the chief conquerors. Uh, Hernando de Soto added Florida. It is another interesting fact that the colonizing nations sought homes as much like their native European ones as possible. Thus, Spain, a rugged mountainous peninsula, struck boldly over land. France, a land of great rivers, followed the Mississippi, Ohio, and St. Lawrence valleys. The Dutch, Portuguese, and English, who lived near the sea, at first kept to the shorelines or the islands. All the exploring nations sought gold and silver, but only the Spaniards found much of either. Oh boy. Oh boy, I lost my place here. Only the Spaniards found much of either. Their treasure ships brought back stores of bullion, increasing prices and wages and hastening the coming of free contracts on a cash basis and the business of banking. Failing to find gold and silver, the colonizing nations sought other commodities which could be traded for them. The English, for example, found sugarcane and tobacco useful staples in the south, and furs, fish, and forest timber in the north. The Dutch brought back from the East Indies wealth in spices and even tentatively began to trade with China and Japan. In the early 19th century, cotton from the South became the chief American export. This was less of importance in the colonial period. The new continent should have been called Columbia, or perhaps Arasconcia, after the Norse explorer, Leif Erikson. Actually, it bears the name of Florentin geographer and navigator Amerigo Vespucci. He was an able mapmaker, one of the first to realize the New World was not an eastern wing of the old, but a continent in its own right, and his name became attached to it. It hardly matters, for the name of Columbus is given to a South American nation, to our federal capital district, and to many a city in the United States. I'm just gonna check if there's. Okay, that is a new page. These videos are going to be a little longer, as you could probably have guessed, than the pictorial history. But it's really interesting what they're getting into with the colonialization. A lot of times we kind of, in schools and things like that, we kind of hurry over a lot of it. But this is quite the important time in world history. You have great empires rise from places that weren't quite great empires. For instance, Spain. Spain is not quite a great empire, but they rise to greatness through obviously the marriage of Aragon and Castile, but and also the gold and wealth, and also the geographies of these nations really influenced where they were willing to go. Like they said, Spain was able to go through land. They were a mountainous country. They liked the idea. And so they were able to more easily get through a lot of these places, whereas France traveled up rivers, and you can see a lot of the territorial gains through that lens, and it really makes a lot of sense. Well, now we're going to try to explain all of the pictures here. Um, so in this picture here, 16th century sailors were able to chart their course by observing the stars. In this one here, um, those great navigators, the Norsemen, would often breach their boats and use them as a shelter. And we can see that a lot. The longboat, it was a decent shelter. And on the first voyage of On his first voyage of exploration, Christopher Columbus landed at San Salvador, now known as Watling Island, in the central area of the Bahamas on the 12th of October, 1492. Um, the expedition had been financed in 1492 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, who, earlier that year, had finally managed to conquer the final Moorish outpost in their country at Granada and had expelled Jews who refused to accept Catholicism. And you got to remember, Spain is very Catholic, and Jews and um, the Moors, who are Islamic peoples, they were not very well accepted into Spain. Not just Spain, but a lot of nations at this time. So it makes sense that this stuff allowed them to more greatly do what they wanted. So here we can see Henry Hudson, the English explorer, sailed up the river valley that bears his name. The Dutch explorers took advantage of his discoveries and founded the settlement of New Netherlands, which became New York when the British gained control of the area. At the top here, Vasco Nuez de Balboa, the Spanish explorer, discovered the Pacific Ocean and claimed dominion over the South Seas for Spain. And here, Hernan Cortes, the conqueror of Mexico, was first received by the Aztec Emperor Montezuma in a style befitting a foreign dignitary. The opposite page above, Hernando de Soto of Spain discovered the Mississippi River and claimed what is now the state of Florida for the Spanish crown. And at the right, an early Spanish settlement in Florida. Yeah, Spain owned Florida for quite a while. We think about it as an American state now, but for a long time it was Spanish. Um, Spain had a lot of the Bahama area, the Gulf of Mexico, or in that area. A lot of it they had claimed. And so if you look at an old map, you can see a lot of Spanish territory. There's only a little bit which was French in there. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways you can improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I always appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.